A dangerous drug packing a growing punch to Portland and beyond.
Drug overdoses are soaring.
I've never seen a drug threat pop like fentanyl.
It's known as the greatest threat.
My generation is dying. 108,000 Americans are dying of drug overdose every year. The fentanyl epidemic is not unique to Oregon. The only thing exceptional about Oregon is its willingness to try to do something radically different. Measure 110 was a ballot measure in 2020 that brought misdemeanor drug possession down to essentially a traffic ticket. So it's no longer an arrestable offense, and it diverted the majority of our cannabis tax revenue into a fund for substance use services all across the state. Tens of thousands of Oregonians have already accessed these services. People are housed due to this funding. People are in treatment. People have gotten jobs for the first time in decades, and that is completely being left out of the narrative. There's a lot of frustration that people who have been cited for drug possession were not actually connected to treatment. But we have no way of actually tracking that. Unless they held on to that piece of paper that the police officer gave them, which most people don't, because they assume whatever services are being offered by that cop are coercive, because historically that has been the case. They're afraid that if they call that number, they're going to be mandated into yet another punitive abstinence-based treatment that might end up with them going to jail if they don't comply with the terms. And historically, drug treatment services through the criminal justice system have not had good success rates. People are so used to linking drug possession to law enforcement that they think if these citations from the cops aren't working, then the whole thing isn't working. But it's a paradigm shift. We are removing law enforcement from the equation. When people talk about Measure 110, they hyper-focus on inpatient treatment, which it did not fund because that is reimbursable through Medicaid. Measure 110 tried to fund things that were historically unfunded or underfunded, such as peer mentoring and harm reduction. Inpatient treatment is not even the gold standard for addiction treatment. In fact, it has some abysmally low success rates, and it's incredibly expensive to boot. But Measure 110 has rapidly expanded access to medications for opioid use disorder. And those increase the 5-year survival rate by 50%. Engaging with harm reduction services increases the likelihood that someone will eventually engage with treatment. But it's about planting that seed that you are worthy. And then eventually people start to believe it. And then they choose treatment or choose recovery for themselves. People constantly conflate homelessness with addiction, and they point to cities like Portland or San Francisco. But the states that have some of the highest rates of substance use and drug overdose don't have the highest rates of homelessness. Why is that? Because their rent is still affordable. The number one predictor of homelessness is cost of living. And so as the rents in Portland have skyrocketed, so has our homelessness. Yes, we do have a drug crisis. And yes, we do have a housing crisis. But one thing did not cause the other. When I was struggling with my addiction 10 years ago, Portland rents were still relatively affordable. And so when I was suffering, I was doing it behind closed doors. What people seem to be most upset about is that they can see the suffering. Addiction is defined as continued use despite negative consequences. And so this notion that if the criminal justice system would only ramp up the negative consequences, that would somehow work, it just doesn't make sense. People need access to on-demand services. People need compassion and care. They need someone to care about them so they can start caring about themselves.